And good afternoon, Charles Moscowitz here. My guest is Nick Adams. Nick is the author of the new book, Trump and Churchill, Defenders of Western Civilization. Nick, thanks for joining me.
Charles, it's a pleasure.
You know, Nick, I noticed this as well. I mean, the similarities between President Trump and Winston Churchill. I've always thought that there were great, both stylistic and policy similarities. So talk a little bit about your premise there.
Well, look, I think that both men, both Donald Trump and Winston Churchill, are unique. They're historic and they're consequential figures. In my opinion, they are both the greatest leaders in modern history. Both men are going to be remembered. Well, one is definitely already remembered and one will be in the future remembered, I think, for what they did for Western civilization. Now, on the surface, Charles, there are a lot of differences. Of course, one was 5'6" and loved to drink. The other is a 6'3" teetotaler. One is a great tweeter, the other a great orator. One loved to take naps in the afternoon and one barely sleeps. So there are a lot of differences on the surface, but as soon as you start to drill down a little, you find that both men are remarkably similar. Both refuse to conform to expectations or conceal their true selves. Both of them loved their country. Both were intensely disliked, even hated. Both alpha males. Both were clear thinkers and plain speakers. Both of them followed very weak predecessors. Of course, Churchill had Chamberlain and Donald Trump had Barack Obama. And I think that only served to magnify the difference. I mean, the volcanic will of Churchill and Trump is very different to the jellyfish spines of Obama and Chamberlain. So the two of them, there are incredible parallels between the times, between the men, between their personalities. And not many people had written or have written yet about a historical perspective of Donald Trump, which is what I have tried to give in Trump and Churchill, Defenders of Western Civilization.
I think that it's very well put. And I think the similarities are both stylistic and also political, policy-wise. Stylistically, I think they both were bucking the establishment of their day. I think Chamberlain represented the kind of the liberal establishment, world get along, everybody should have peace in our time, and we should all, create this peaceable, totally unrealistic worldview. And I think the same thing was true with Obama in his appeasement all over the world. And you have a guy like Trump and a guy like Churchill come in who's plain spoken and who's blunt and who isn't afraid to not conform to the kind of establishmentese language, what French scholar Alain Benescon called the language of totalitarianism. Everything is a lot of doublespeak, a lot of sophistry, a lot of triple double meanings, and a lot of kind of code words. Trump and Churchill too. I mean, they were brilliant speakers. Trump in a very crude way, but nevertheless, he tells it as it is, and he speaks it. He's a very effective communicator, and it's what I think it's the basis of both of their appeals. People are tired of that kind of shopped around, euphemistic language where everything is tested and measured and and everything is studied, and they want to just hear somebody be real and be blunt.
Charles, yeah, I'm sorry. I was just going to say you're absolutely right. And if there's just two things that I might add there, one is that in the book I include several quotes that came directly from British newspapers in the late 1930s and in the early 40s. And if I didn't tell you that those particular quotes were referring to Winston Churchill, you would think that they were speaking about Donald Trump. So similar were the criticisms and was the language used about both men. And the other thing that I would add to that is that yeah, you're right. Look, Trump is a great master of social media, which obviously is the platform of the day. Both also very optimistic. Now, that's something that, I think is often overlooked. Both always offered a sunny disposition about the prospects, very sanguine about what was going to happen. And we see that right now with Donald Trump and how he's communicating with the American public about the invisible enemy.
Right.
Another very Churchillian, I thought, way to badge this virus that we're combating. And he's come under fire for being too optimistic. And I think the New York mayor came out yesterday and said that he's peddling a false optimism. But both men had that in common as well. Churchill was always reassuring and encouraging and reminding that we were going to win and it was going to be okay and things would go back to what they were and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and by the way, that was the same New York mayor who called for the nationalization of industries and martial law. Would have been like Cuba by now if he had been president. Trump has, and which gets me to my next point, and that Trump, like Churchill, I think at his soul is a very conservative leader. And that in and itself is somewhat counter-revolutionary. They are leaders of a resurgence of concepts that go back to the great liberal ideas of the founding of the American Republic and of British thinkers like Locke and others, where the rights come from the individual and they ultimately come from God, and that the government is just there to protect those rights. It's not to be worshipped, which is the reason why I think the left, if you don't mind my saying, is so euphemistic in their language is because they can't come out and tell you what they really believe in, because nobody in their right mind would go for that. So they make postures. I mean, they say, oh, well, we're going to protect the national border. Everybody knows that's BS, and they have no intention. It's just boo bait, Whereas when Trump says it, he means it and does it. And Churchill, too. I mean, Churchill was a proud nationalist of what he called that island race, as he called it, of Britain and it was under assault. And he drew the parallel between that nation and the evil forces that had conquered Europe at that time, mainly the Nazis and the communists. And, he did so unabashedly. He did so after the war, too, in his battle against the Soviets. And I think Trump is like that as well. I mean, he compares and he contrasts the superiority of the Western civilization to these backward and totalitarian and dictatorial tyrannies, and does so effectively. And that's what drives him crazy.
I'm with you, Charles. If you get a list of adjectives that you might describe Winston Churchill with, you could probably apply almost to a fault every single one of those same adjectives to Donald Trump. And there is something about how these men were fearless. They had experts around them. They had advisors around them whose counsel they sought. But ultimately, they always went with their gut instinct, which is a very unique trait of phenomenal leadership. And I think that's what we saw both with Churchill and with Donald Trump. And as you say, that doesn't really it's not very compatible with the way that politics is done today, full of focus study groups and polling and all of this kind of stuff. And I think that the average, everyday, ordinary person really responds to somebody that is decisive and follows their instinct and asks people to come along with them in that. So in other words, they don't conform to the consensus, they create the consensus. And that's something that both Churchill and Trump were and are very skilled at.
I agree. Now, Nick Adams, what do you think is going on now with this epidemic we're all dealing with? It is a real disease. It's a terrible disease. But yet the politics worry me when I hear people like you mentioned, the mayor of New York and others who want to use this as a leverage to, reassert their kind of authoritarian powers and combat somebody like President Trump, who is moderate in his approach to it. He wants to depend on the state governments. He wants to move carefully. He's not seizing the power necessarily. And by the way, how is that working out with Boris Johnson as well?
Well, look, I think you're certainly right, Charles. There is a huge conglomerate of people, of enemies, opponents, detractors of the president that are taking full advantage of this pandemic. You think about how everything just collapsed overnight. President Trump had the greatest economy. It was booming, the lowest unemployment rate, all of the things that we remember from the Obama era, ISIS, al-Baghdadi, Soleimani were pulverized. No president had done as much for Christians and Israel and life as this particular president. And then all of a sudden overnight, all of that, we can't say became irrelevant, but certainly all of that kind of receded into the background. And now this election is very much going to be fought upon how the Trump administration deals with this coronavirus, as unprecedented as it is. And it doesn't help when you've got the media that is creating or doing their best to kind of maintain this level of hysteria and fear. So look, it's going to be very interesting. I'm very optimistic. I think that this president's not only going to win, but I think he's going to win big on the 6th of November this year. Last time voters were voting for him on spec, and this time, Charles, they know exactly what he's capable of doing in good times. And if he was able to do that in good times, I suspect they're going to have enough confidence in him to do it in bad times as well. Boris Johnson, well, his battle with coronavirus is really the stuff of legends. He's going to come back out of this stronger and bigger and better than ever before, fresh off his Brexit win. He's got the makings to be a great leader as well, but British politics is a little less predictable than US politics, in my experience, because it reminds me of Australian politics. And the famous line there is that a day is a long time. So remains to be seen.
Well, I think that both of these leaders and others around the world represent this resurgence of reestablishing the rights of the nation state, which is, I think, a positive thing. I mean, it certainly was what Churchill was all about in defeating this conquering empire that tried to occupy all of Europe, and then the communist movement as well. And to me, that's a progressive movement, and I think that hopefully this pandemic is going to accentuate the need for that, because now we see that you need to have even local governments and state governments operating, in dealing with a crisis as it's happening in their particular area. So,
Charles, if there's any silver lining out of what we're experiencing, and these are very trying and challenging and dark times, it's this. I think globalism has been dealt a very, very severe blow. I think people have woken up to China, the threat of China, and I think now it's a different ball game. So if there's anything that's good to come out of that, it will be, I think you're right, the reemergence of this concept of sovereign nations, of protecting one's borders and realizing the morality of protecting one's borders, determining who comes into the country and the circumstances under which they come, is both, in my mind, a very moral and very patriotic position to take. So I think that all of that has certainly received some wind in its sails, and that's, in these times, all you can really do is look for that silver lining.
I know, and I think we need to understand also that both Trump and Churchill were Christian leaders. They were leaders of what Western European civilization in its best sense. And a reassertion of all of those values that created this incredible civilization, including tolerance and including, genuine, real diversity of opinion, unlike what the left's into, which is everyone to goose step along in the same mindset. And I hope that people can understand that and why that's important, especially in these times.
I certainly hope so, Charles, and I dedicate a very significant part of my book, Trump and Churchill, Defenders of Western Civilization, to that, and to how both leaders were proponents of the traditional Western values, that they embraced those values, they didn't apologize for them. In fact, they offered a full-throated defense and advancement of those values, even when so many people were screaming otherwise. And it's very important for Americans to understand that the battle for the West is the primary one of our time, because if we lose America, we lose Western civilization. And if we lose Western civilization, then all of those threats that we don't like, radical Islamism, China, socialism, communism, all of that stuff is going to be victorious. And that means that we won't be able to lead the lives with the opportunity and the happiness and the freedom that we've always enjoyed.
Those are the same villainous forces that have been around since Adam and Eve, and every generation needs to stand up to it. Winston Churchill did it in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, and now Trump is doing it. So I think that your points are very well taken, Nick. Nick, how can people get your excellent book? And by the way, one of the things I like about the book is that you go into a lot of the quotes from each of the leaders and you show the literal similarities. Anyway, how can people get your book?
People can go to Amazon.com. They can go to BN.com. That's Barnes & Noble's website, or Amazon. It's available right now to be ordered. It's got a foreword by Newt Gingrich.
Right.
The title is Trump and Churchill, Defenders of Western Civilization. It is a critical book if you want to have a clear understanding of the dangers that America faces and the world, and the type of qualities that we need in a leader. And it's compulsory reading for quarantine and for the 2020 election.
That's a good quarantine. It should be on the quarantine bookshelf. All right. Well, Nick, thanks so much for joining me. I'd like to be in touch with you, especially as the election moves up, and get some more insight. So I appreciate you joining me today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, Charles.
All right, Nick Adams, thanks a lot. I'll put a link up to YouTube. Thank you. Have a great afternoon.
You too.
Thank you. All right, Nick, I'll send you a link once it's up on YouTube. Thank you.
I really appreciate that, Charles. Thank you, sir. Bye-bye.
My pleasure. Bye-bye.